Three explorers ventured deep into the Congo basin following a cryptic journal entry from a 19th-century naturalist. Mpilo, a Congolese guide whose family has lived in the region for generations, leads them alongside Jakob, an archaeologist searching for pre-colonial trade settlements, and Sarah, a documentary filmmaker documenting lost histories. During the dry season, they discover that an unexpected drought has exposed structures buried beneath the swamp for centuries. What emerges from the receding waters suggests an organized settlement far more sophisticated than any recorded in the region's known history. But the jungle keeps its secrets reluctantly, and others have already noticed their discovery. Chapter 1. The Swamp's Memory. The Congo swallows sound before it swallows men. That was the first lesson Mpilo offered as they pushed through the dense vegetation where the river had begun to retreat, leaving behind exposed mud and the skeletal remains of flooded trees. The dry season had come early and harsh, starving the wetlands, and what emerged from that slow recession was a landscape reborn, raw, vulnerable, and impossibly ancient. Jakob knelt at the water's edge where the mud still held the imprint of shapes beneath. His gloved hands moved carefully across the surface, tracing geometric patterns that no river current alone could have carved. Sarah's camera caught everything. The way the afternoon light fractured through the canopy, the way Mpilo's expression shifted from guide to something else entirely, a man recognizing his own land as stranger. "How long have these been here?" Sarah asked, her voice careful, testing the weight of the question. Mpilo didn't answer immediately. He stepped into the swamp water, his machete hanging loose at his side, and pointed toward a darker shape rising from the mud perhaps 50 meters into the receding wetland. It was stone, not drift, not natural formation, a corner where angles met at precision. "My grandfather spoke of old paths," Mpilo said finally. "Ways the ancestors walked before the water came. He said the swamp had moods, that some seasons it gave back what it had taken. The swamp was giving back something now." Jakob stood, water dripping from his knees, and moved toward the structure. His pace quickened despite his training, despite everything he'd learned about patience and documentation and the danger of assumption. But this was different. This was unmistakable. As they waded deeper, more shapes emerged. Not scattered stones, but arranged blocks, edges too deliberate to be coincidence, too weathered to be colonial. The air changed as they approached. Cooler. The jungle sounds seemed to retreat, the constant chatter of monkeys and insects diminishing to a watchful quiet. Sarah noticed it first and mentioned it to Jakob, who dismissed it as imagination born of expectation. But Mpilo heard nothing because he was already examining the first structure closely. It was roughly rectangular, perhaps 4 meters across, constructed from stone blocks that still held traces of mortar despite centuries submerged. "Not natural," Jakob whispered almost to himself. "This is deliberate construction." "How old?" Sarah asked, filming the exterior where algae clung in patterns that suggested depth of submersion. "That's the question that changes everything," Jakob replied. "If this is pre-colonial, undocumented, we're looking at a settlement that shouldn't exist." Mpilo circled the structure, his eyes moving across the surface with an intensity that suggested he was reading something in the weathered stone. When he looked up, his expression had shifted. Something had clicked behind his eyes. "We should mark this location and return at first light," he said. "The swamp reveals its secrets slowly, and we're not alone in thinking this land holds value." Jakob turned to look at him. "What do you mean, not alone?" "I mean," Mpilo said quietly, "someone else has already been here. Recently. Look at the mud around the eastern corner. Boot prints. Fresh enough that the water hasn't completely reclaimed them. Someone knows about this place, and they know its secrets matter." Sarah and Jakob exchanged a look. The jungle had grown darker while they worked, the canopy overhead thickening as clouds moved in from the north. The temperature had dropped perceptibly. The swamp, which had seemed merely mysterious moments before, now felt possessive, as though it had opened its doors with intention and was now watching to see who would claim what lay inside. As they marked the location and began their careful retreat from the water, none of them could shake the sensation of being observed. The jungle around them was full of eyes. Some were merely animal, but Mpilo kept his machete closer than before, and Jakob photographed their position with the meticulous focus of a man suddenly aware that documentation might become evidence. The swamp had given back its memory. But memories, they were beginning to understand, could be dangerous things, especially when others were searching for them too. Chapter 2. The Geometry of Stone. At first light, the jungle looked entirely different. The overnight rain had transformed the swamp into something almost primordial, water rising around the structures they'd found, the canopy above dripping in a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat measured in droplets. Mpilo led them back through the darkness before dawn, his knowledge of the terrain absolute, his movements economical and purposeful. The stone structures had multiplied overnight. Or rather, the receding water had revealed more of what lay beneath. What had appeared as isolated edifices yesterday was now recognizable as part of a larger arrangement. The structures formed a pattern when viewed from elevation, a geometry that suggested planning, purpose, organization. Jakob had brought proper equipment this morning, measurement tools, a basic field survey kit, notebooks designed to withstand wet conditions. Sarah had brought better lighting and a drone, though flying it through such dense jungle would be nearly impossible. They would document what they could from the ground and hope it was enough. The first structure they approached had an opening, not a window but a deliberate aperture positioned on its southern face. Inside, despite the damp and the decay, they found something that froze all three of them in place. Markings, not random patterns but systematic incisions in the stone. Lines that formed shapes that suggested numerical notation or perhaps symbolic language. "This is astronomical," Jakob breathed, his camera capturing every angle. "Look at the orientation, and these marks. They correlate to seasonal positions." Mpilo ran his hand across the stone, his fingers finding grooves that centuries of water had not fully erased. "The ancestors recorded time," he said. It wasn't a question. "But that means—" Sarah started. "It means this wasn't subsistence settlement," Jakob finished. "This was administrative, organized, sophisticated enough to track seasons, which means crops, calendars, planning for harvests. This suggests a civilization, not just a community." They moved deeper into the complex. More structures emerged as they progressed, some small, some larger with interior chambers that still held the echo of occupation, despite the centuries of abandonment. In one chamber, partially protected from the elements by its depth beneath the original ground level, they found artifacts, pottery fragments, their surfaces marked with the same geometric patterns, stone tools worn smooth by use, and something else. Coins. Old coins. Metal so corroded they were barely recognizable, but the size and weight suggested genuine currency. "Colonial period?" Sarah asked, photographing each discovery in situ before they touched anything. "No," Jakob said, his voice strained. "These are older. The metallurgy is different. The wear pattern. This is pre-colonial, definitely. And if these structures are contemporaneous with this metalwork—" He trailed off, clearly reluctant to voice the implication. "They're saying there was trade here," Mpilo said quietly. "Exchange, not isolated, connected to something larger. Centuries before any European arrival," Jakob added. It was Sarah who heard the sound first. Not from the jungle, but from behind them, near the water's edge where they'd entered. The sound of someone moving deliberately through the swamp, making no effort to be quiet, making every effort to be heard. Approaching. 3 figures emerged from the mist rising off the water. 2 men and a woman, all carrying equipment of their own, and all moving with the confidence of people who believed they had every right to be here. The woman in front held up her hands in a gesture of no threat, but her smile suggested otherwise. "Well," she said in English with a French accent, "it appears we're not the only ones who've read the old journals." Jakob's jaw tightened. "Who are you?" "Dr. Emily Rousseau," she said. And you've just stumbled into the discovery my team has been tracking for 3 years. The question now is whether we share what we find, or whether this gets complicated. Chapter 3. The Rivals. Dr. Rousseau's team established themselves with the efficiency of people who had been planning this expedition far longer than Jakob's group had. Her equipment was better: satellite mapping, ground-penetrating radar, the kind of technology that suggested institutional backing. She explained it over coffee that evening, as the 4 of them sat at a distance from Mpilo, who had taken position on a fallen tree, watching everything with the expression of a man who had seen this scenario play out before, though perhaps in different forms. I represent a foundation dedicated to documenting pre-colonial African commerce networks, Rousseau explained. What you found here is part of a larger pattern. Trading posts established across Central Africa, centuries before the transatlantic economy. Sophisticated, documented, deliberately hidden by colonial powers who preferred the narrative of empty land awaiting civilization. Why? Sarah asked, though she seemed to already know the answer. Why hide it? Because it contradicts the entire justification for colonization, Rousseau said simply. If Africa had sophisticated trade, technology, organization, the moral argument for civilizing the continent collapses. So they erased it. Actively, systematically. They destroyed records, reinterpreted evidence, built narratives that made Africans either primitive or external to their own history. Jakob listened but said nothing. Sarah's camera was off now, but her notebook was out, recording Rousseau's words in shorthand that no one could quite read. The journal that led you here, Rousseau continued. A naturalist named Devereaux, correct? 1887 expedition into the Congo. He documented these structures and tried to publish his findings. But the colonial authorities buried his research. What we're looking at is a settlement that was deliberately submerged in historical record long before the swamp claimed it physically. Why tell us this? Jakob asked finally. Because I need your cooperation, Rousseau said. My team is well equipped but small. Yours brings local knowledge through your guide, invaluable for navigation. Together, we can document this properly before the rains return. Separately, we'll hamper each other, waste resources, and possibly damage what we find in the conflict. Or, Sarah said carefully, you could be planning to use our resources and then marginalize us from the publication. Rousseau smiled. That would be the cynical view, but you're right to consider it. So let's establish boundaries now. We share all findings. We publish together. We credit each other appropriately. And, she added, leaning forward slightly, we both benefit from what this discovery means, not just for archaeology, but for rewriting history. Jakob wanted to refuse on principle, but principle rarely survived contact with opportunity, and this was opportunity. Genuine, significant, the kind of discovery that defined careers. He looked at Sarah, who looked at Mpilo, who was still watching the jungle with the expression of someone who had already made his decision, but was waiting to see if others would catch up. We work together, Jakob said. But we maintain separate documentation. Everything you discover, we photograph independently. Everything we find, you get copies of. We move as 2 teams, compare notes daily, and if we find evidence of conflict, if one team tries to hide findings, we dissolve the partnership immediately and go public with what we have. Agreed, Rousseau said without hesitation. In fact, I'll do you one better. I have contacts with a major journal. Whatever we find, they'll want to publish it. International spotlight. Your names will be on every paper. Sarah's camera was back out now, recording Rousseau's commitment to that promise. Insurance, in the form of documentation. But Mpilo stood up then, his movement sudden enough to draw everyone's attention. He pointed toward the jungle, toward the sound of something large moving through the vegetation. Something that had nothing to do with the normal nocturnal life of the Congo. More people, Mpilo said quietly. Coming from the north, approaching carefully. They move like men with intention and weapons. The 2 teams looked at each other. The moment of negotiation suddenly transformed into something else entirely. The swamp had drawn attention from more than just academic rivals. Others had noticed the revelation of these ancient structures, and those others were approaching from the darkness with a very different purpose in mind. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Chapter 4: The Swamp's Mercy. The rain came before the strangers reached them, transformed from forecast to immediate threat in the span of minutes. The jungle had its own timeline, and morning weather became evening emergency with the speed of the tropics. Water began rising through the camp, the swamp responding to the precipitation by expanding its territory, reclaiming land it had temporarily surrendered. "We need to move," Mpilo said, already breaking down equipment with economical precision. The swamp becomes unstable, sinkholes open, the ground gives way. Rousseau's team mobilized just as quickly, but there was a moment of calculation visible in her movements, weighing the value of their instruments against the immediacy of danger. She chose speed, which meant leaving behind some of the more sensitive equipment, securing it in waterproof cases and hoping the rise in water level would keep it protected rather than destroy it. Jakob and Sarah worked alongside Mpilo, who moved with a certainty that seemed almost choreographed. He had navigated this swamp during floods before, knew the patterns of its rebellion, understood where the ground would hold and where it would betray. He moved them toward higher ground, away from the structures, away from the camp, toward a ridge of land that the swamp could not quite claim. Behind them, the voices of the approaching strangers were obliterated by thunder. The jungle became a place of pure sound and motion, visibility reduced to meters, the distinction between water and sky and vegetation becoming philosophical rather than practical. The rain fell with the indifference of something that had no need for mercy. They reached the ridge as the ground behind them began to shift. Mpilo had been right. Sinkholes appeared where the camp had been moments before, the earth collapsing into voids that had been masked by dried surface. One of Rousseau's team members turned back, saw the devastation, and continued forward without comment. There was nothing to retrieve. The swamp had reclaimed its authority. In the shelter of a limestone outcropping, they waited for the storm to pass. Mpilo had produced a fire with materials he'd apparently collected while everyone else was working, the flames somehow defying the wet to burn steadily, pushing back the darkness and the sense of being buried beneath the jungle's weight. "The swamp protects what it holds," Mpilo said, offering this as explanation or philosophy or both. "It opens and closes on its own schedule. The people who lived there understood this. They built knowing the water would return." "Temporary settlements?" Sarah asked, though the way she said it suggested she already understood. "Seasonal," Mpilo confirmed. "They came when the water receded, worked, traded, then retreated when the rains began. The structures weren't permanent because they didn't need to be. The system was designed for cycles." Jakob was thinking aloud now, piecing together implications, which means there could be more settlements. Upstream, downstream, inland. This wasn't isolated. This was part of a network adapted to the Congo's rhythms. "Which is why the records were destroyed so thoroughly," Rousseau added quietly. "A network that sophisticated, that well-adapted, that clearly evidence of sophisticated civilization, that threatened the entire colonial project." "But the strangers approaching," Sarah said. "They knew about this. They came specifically. That means someone has been researching this too. Someone who knew what to look for." Mpilo stirred the fire without speaking. He was listening to sounds beneath the storm, detecting patterns in the chaos. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a certainty that bordered on prophecy. "The journal that led you here, Devereaux's journal, it wasn't lost. Someone has had it. Someone has been following its trail, and they're not here for history. They're here for value. The sites, the artifacts, the evidence, to them, it's not discovery, it's acquisition." "Grave robbers," Sarah said, shock evident even through her documentarian's instinct for objectivity. "Collectors," Rousseau corrected, her tone bitter. "Better dressed, better funded, legally protected in their own countries, but functionally identical. They acquire fragments of history and house them in private collections or auction them to the highest bidder. History becomes commodity. The fire crackled, and in its light, Jakob suddenly understood what they were facing. This wasn't just an academic competition. This was a race against systematic erasure. Whatever evidence of pre-colonial sophistication existed in these swamp structures would be destroyed or dispersed unless they documented it first, completely, and made it public in ways that couldn't be later buried. "Tomorrow," he said, "we work through the day and night if necessary. We photograph everything. We establish the date through geological samples. We document the patterns, the mathematics, the evidence of trade. We make it impossible for anyone to deny what was here." Outside, the storm continued its assault, and somewhere in that chaos the strangers had either sought shelter or turned back. Either way, they had been granted time. The swamp, in its mercy, had provided what they needed, a temporary barrier against those who would come to take rather than to learn. Chapter 5. The Language of Stone. The dawn brought clarity, and a swamp transformed. Water had risen nearly 2 meters, the structures now partially submerged again, the recession reversing itself as it always would. The window that the unusual drought had opened was closing, and they worked with the understanding that time had moved from abundant to precious. Mpilo and Jakob descended into the water while Rousseau's team managed drying equipment and Sarah coordinated documentation, ensuring that every photograph, every measurement, every discovered artifact was immediately processed and secured in redundant locations. They were racing the water now, literally, documenting what they could before the swamp reclaimed it all. In the central structure, in a chamber that had been protected enough to preserve what lay within, they found the record that changed everything. Not dramatically, no sudden revelation, no moment of external transformation. Just a systematic accumulation of evidence that, when assembled, told a story that had been suppressed for over a century. Tablets of stone inscribed with marks that Jakob recognized immediately as a record-keeping system. Mathematics, astronomy, trade calculations. The marks appeared alongside samples of different materials: copper, silver, iron in various states of refinement. Not just evidence of trade, but documentation of it. The original merchants recording their business in stone because stone endured when paper burned and water decayed. They were teaching the next generation, Sarah said, understanding the implication immediately. This wasn't hidden. This was meant to be studied, left deliberately for those who would come after. Or hidden from those who would come after, Jakob countered. These tablets were placed in a chamber designed to be protected from casual discovery. Whoever built this knew their records would be valuable. But Mpilo had moved past both interpretations to something more fundamental. He stood before the largest tablet, his hand moving across the carved surface, reading something in the geometric patterns that neither Jakob nor Sarah could quite perceive. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of connection across centuries. They recorded their survival, Mpilo said. Year by year, water depth, harvest results, trading partners, birth records, everything needed to maintain the system. This was institutional knowledge, the foundation of civilization. The word struck them all with its simplicity and its radical implications. This wasn't artifact. This was evidence of civilization, not primitive, not unsophisticated, not in need of external salvation or improvement. Organized, documented, adaptive, sustainable across centuries. Rousseau emerged from another chamber, her face pale behind her enthusiasm. She held objects carefully as though they might fracture under the weight of their own significance. Jewelry. Not crude or primitive, but refined, featuring techniques that matched contemporary metalwork from across known trade routes. Evidence of contact, evidence of skill, evidence of aesthetic sophistication. This changes everything, she said, though the statement seemed inadequate to contain what they were experiencing. It changes narratives, Jakob corrected carefully. What it fundamentally changes is whether we can suppress it. If we record this correctly, if we make it public in ways that can't be ignored, this becomes the story, not the exception. The baseline from which everything else is measured. They worked through the day as water rose incrementally, as the swamp reasserted its patient dominance, as the window they'd been granted continued closing. Every artifact was photographed from multiple angles. Every inscription was traced and scanned. Every measurement was recorded and cross-checked. The documentation became an obsession, a race against both the rising water and the approaching strangers who had not, it seemed, turned back but merely repositioned themselves, waiting. As evening approached, Jakob noticed them through the trees, 3 figures on the ridge above the swamp, watching. Not approaching, not yet, but clearly present, clearly marking the location, clearly ready to move when opportunity presented itself. Rousseau saw them too, and made a calculation visible behind her eyes. "We need to leave tonight," she said. "Take what we have. Get to Kinshasa. Get it to the journal. Get it published before they can interfere." "Abandon the site?" Sarah asked. "The site will be here," Rousseau said. "It's been here for centuries. It'll survive our departure. What might not survive is the documentation if we stay and engage with those people." Mpilo nodded agreement, his decision apparently made long before they articulated the necessity. "The water will continue rising. In 3 days, everything returns to submersion. The swamp protects its secrets again." So they gathered what they had documented, secured the redundant copies, and prepared for extraction. The strangers on the ridge watched them work without moving, without intervening. They seemed content to observe, to note, to mark positions for later retrieval. They were patient hunters. They understood that the swamp would provide opportunity, that the explorers would eventually leave, and that what was discovered could be controlled if you held the right leverage in the right moments. But they had not counted on the documentation being dispersed, on copies already transmitted beyond their reach, on the story being ready to escape their control entirely. Chapter 6. The legacy reclaimed the journal that reached the editorial office in Geneva, arrived in careful package alongside photographs, measurements, geological analysis, and something even more valuable: testimony. 3 investigators, now 2 research teams aligned by shared discovery, offering not just evidence but interpretation, context, understanding. The editing process took weeks because the implications required verification from specialists across multiple disciplines. But in the end, the publication could not be suppressed. Too many people knew about it now. Too many institutions were invested in verifying its claims. The narrative shifted, not globally but significantly, from Africa awaiting civilization to Africa developing civilization, while Europe was still learning agriculture. The names of Mpilo, Jakob, Sarah, and Rousseau appeared in footnotes and acknowledgments, but the real revolution was more fundamental. The record had been rescued. The strangers on the ridge had eventually approached the swamp site, only to find it flooded, the structures submerged once more, the season having fully turned. By then, the story had already reached audiences across continents. The suppression that had lasted a century was broken in a matter of weeks once the evidence became public. Universities began sending their own expeditions. The colonial narratives began requiring revision. History itself began to shift under the weight of what had been hidden. Jakob established a research center dedicated to pre-colonial trade networks across Central Africa. Sarah's documentary received international recognition, premiering at festivals and changing how people understood African history. Rousseau published her findings across multiple journals, her career transformed by the discovery she had sought for so long. And Mpilo returned to his village, to his family, to a land that the wider world had finally begun to see as it actually was, not empty, not primitive, not awaiting rescue, continuous, intentional, civilized in ways that the colonizers had been forced to deny. The swamp itself recedes and returns with the seasons, its rhythm unchanged by the momentary attention of humans. The structures remain underwater now, patient, waiting for the next emergence to reveal again what previous generations had built. But their meaning has been transformed by documentation, by publication, by the simple act of making evidence impossible to suppress. What remains is not just the physical artifacts but the memory that has been reclaimed. The knowledge that sophisticated human civilization existed in the Congo, not as exception but as norm. That organization and trade and learning had flourished in these waterlands for centuries before external forces attempted to erase that history. The true treasure was never the objects themselves, but the narrative that could no longer be rewritten. The truth that had finally been allowed to exist in the historical record where it had always belonged. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.